Emotional distance doesn't announce itself. It arrives through behavior you weren't supposed to notice. There's a specific moment in relationship dynamics when something shifts, and most people miss it. Not because it's invisible, but because it doesn't look like what they expect distance to look like. There's no argument, no accusation, no dramatic exit. Just a series of small behavioral changes that, taken individually, seem meaningless. A slower reply, a shorter message, a conversation that ends without warmth. These moments don't register as withdrawal at first. They register as circumstance, as timing, as nothing worth analyzing. But emotional behavior doesn't operate in isolated incidents. It operates in patterns. And patterns, once formed, reveal what words deliberately avoid. This isn't about reading too much into things. It's about recognizing that behavior is a language, often more honest than the one being spoken. When someone begins to emotionally withdraw, their actions shift long before their words do. The attachment patterns that once kept them engaged start to loosen. The psychological dynamics that made closeness feel natural begin to feel heavy, complicated, or optional. And the distance they create isn't always intentional. Sometimes it's unconscious. Sometimes it's self-protective. But intentional or not, the pattern is there. And it's communicating something essential about where the relationship actually stands. What makes emotional withdrawal so difficult to name is that it lives in the margins. It's not what someone says. It's how long they take to say it. It's not that they're unavailable. It's that their availability has become unpredictable, conditional, harder to access. The relationship psychology at work here is subtle, but unmistakable. When someone's emotional investment begins to decline, their behavior reflects that decline in ways that are easy to dismiss, but impossible to ignore, once you know what to look for. The warmth cools. The effort decreases. The reciprocity fades. And the person on the receiving end is left trying to make sense of a shift they can feel but can't quite prove. Most people wait too long to trust what they're noticing. They tell themselves they're overreacting. They rationalize the distance as temporary, situational, or unrelated to the relationship itself. But behavior analysis doesn't require certainty. It requires attention. And when attention is paid consistently, the small behaviors that reveal emotional withdrawal stop being ambiguous. They start forming a narrative, not one of villainy or betrayal, but one of gradual disengagement. A quiet drift away from closeness that happens in increments small enough to deny, but consistent enough to define the entire trajectory of what comes next. There are moments in relationship dynamics when someone becomes emotionally unreachable, and no argument preceded it. No raised voices, no accusations. Just a shift in presence that feels like air leaving a room slowly. The absence doesn't announce itself. It settles in through small behavioral cues. Less eye contact, slower responses, a certain flatness in tone that wasn't there before. What makes this particularly disorienting is the lack of narrative. There's no story to attach to the change, no event to point to and say, that's when it started. The mind searches for reasoning, for something concrete to anchor the feeling, but the behavior itself offers nothing explicit. This is where emotional withdrawal often begins. Not with conflict, but with quiet, unexplained distance. In attachment patterns, this kind of absence functions as a form of communication. It's not always intentional, but it is always informative. When someone pulls back emotionally without explanation, they're signaling something about their internal state, their capacity, or their relationship to closeness in that moment. The person on the receiving end often interprets this through the lens of their own fears, wondering if they did something wrong, if they're being punished, or if they're simply no longer valued. But the behavior itself is rarely about punishment. More often, it reflects a psychological dynamic where emotional engagement has become difficult, heavy, or unsustainable, for reasons the withdrawing person may not fully understand themselves. What complicates this further is that the absence tends to be intermittent at first. One day the person seems present, the next, they're distant. The inconsistency creates confusion, making it hard to trust what's real. Relationship psychology shows that when someone's emotional availability fluctuates without explanation, it destabilizes the other person's ability to orient themselves within the connection. They begin scanning for clues, reading into silences, analyzing tone. The absence becomes the loudest thing in the room, even when nothing is being said. And because there's no conflict to resolve, there's no clear way to address it. The distance exists in a space between words, where behavior becomes the only language left. This is not always the result of malice or indifference. Sometimes emotional distance emerges because someone is struggling internally and lacks the tools or awareness to communicate that struggle. Other times, it reflects a gradual loss of investment that hasn't yet been named. Either way, the pattern reveals itself not through what is said, but through what is withheld. The emotional texture of the relationship begins to thin. And in that thinning, something else starts to take shape, a rhythm that no longer syncs the way it once did. The shift in responsiveness doesn't arrive all at once. It shows up in fragments, replies that come a little slower one day, a text left unread for hours when it used to be answered within minutes, a phone call returned the next morning instead of that night. Each instance taken alone seems reasonable. Life gets busy, people get tired, schedules don't always align. But when these moments begin to repeat, they stop being isolated events and start forming a behavioral pattern. The sporadic nature of it makes it easy to rationalize. Easy to tell yourself you're overreacting. Easy to dismiss as coincidence. But emotional behavior doesn't operate in isolated moments. It builds quietly through repetition, until the absence of consistency becomes the consistency itself. What makes this shift particularly destabilizing is that it doesn't follow a predictable rhythm. If someone were completely unresponsive, the message would be clear. But inconsistency creates a different kind of uncertainty. One day they respond warmly, fully present. The next, they're distant, distracted, barely there. This oscillation keeps the other person in a state of low-level confusion, never quite sure where they stand. Attachment patterns thrive on predictability. When that predictability erodes, the nervous system starts searching for explanations. The mind begins filling in gaps with assumptions, often negative ones, because the behavior itself provides no clarity. And because the shifts are subtle, they're hard to name, hard to bring up, hard to prove. In relationship psychology, this kind of responsiveness, or lack of it, functions as a form of emotional regulation for the person withdrawing. They may not be consciously choosing to create distance, but their behavior reflects a reduced capacity or willingness to engage at the level they once did. The sporadic nature of their presence suggests ambivalence. They haven't fully disengaged, but they're no longer fully invested either. They exist in a middle zone where connection still occurs, but the quality and consistency of that connection has shifted. For the other person, This creates a feeling of always waiting, always wondering, always second-guessing whether their expectations are unreasonable or whether the relationship dynamics have fundamentally changed. What begins to happen, often without conscious awareness, is a recalibration. The person on the receiving end starts adjusting their own behavior to match the new rhythm, reaching out less, expecting less, asking for less. They begin to accommodate the distance as though it's normal, even when it doesn't feel right. And in that accommodation, something deeper starts to take root. A quiet acceptance that the emotional flow has changed, and perhaps that it won't change back. Communication in relationships operates on rhythm. There's a tempo to how people reach out, how quickly they respond, how present they are in the exchange. When that tempo shifts, even slightly, the entire emotional dynamic can begin to feel off. A message that used to get a response within minutes now takes hours. A question that once sparked conversation now receives a brief, functional reply. These delays aren't dramatic. They're small enough to be explained away. But small delays, repeated over time, create a new rhythm entirely. And rhythm, in relationship dynamics, is everything. It's how people feel seen, prioritized, valued. When the rhythm slows, the feeling of connection slows with it. The delays themselves often come with plausible explanations. Work was busy. The phone was on silent. They fell asleep. They got distracted. None of these reasons are inherently dishonest, but when they begin to accumulate, they reveal something about where attention is being allocated. In emotional behavior, responsiveness is a form of investment. When someone consistently delays their replies, even by small increments, it signals that the connection is no longer operating at the same level of priority it once was. The other person begins to notice not just the delays, but the pattern of delays. They start tracking response times, analyzing tone, searching for evidence that things are still okay. The emotional labor of the relationship quietly shifts, one person working harder to maintain the rhythm, while the other lets it drift. What makes this particularly difficult is that the delays are rarely extreme enough to justify confrontation. How do you tell someone they're taking too long to text back without sounding unreasonable? How do you explain that the space between messages feels different now, heavier, more uncertain? Psychological dynamics like these live in the margins, too subtle to name clearly, too consistent to ignore. The person experiencing the delay begins to second-guess their own perception. Maybe they're being too sensitive. Maybe they're expecting too much. Maybe this is just how things are now. But the feeling doesn't go away. It lingers, quietly reshaping how they relate to the other person. Over time, these small delays begin to affect not just the logistics of communication, but the emotional quality of it. Conversations that once felt easy now feel effortful. There's a hesitation before reaching out, a question of whether it's worth it, whether they'll even respond. The spontaneity fades, the warmth cools, and in that cooling, something else begins to emerge, a distance that isn't just about timing, but about tone. There's a noticeable difference between a reply that engages emotionally and one that simply acknowledges. The first carries warmth, curiosity, presence. The second is functional, polite, but flat. When emotionally textured responses begin to disappear from communication, the relationship starts to feel transactional. Messages that once sparked conversation now receive one-word answers. Questions that invited connection are met with short, neutral statements that close the door rather than open it. The content might be polite, even friendly, but the energy behind it has changed. There's no invitation to go deeper. No effort to sustain the exchange. Just enough engagement to avoid being called distant, but not enough to suggest genuine interest. This shift in tone is one of the clearest signs of emotional withdrawal. In relationship psychology, the quality of someone's language, how much they elaborate, how often they ask follow-up questions, how present they are in the exchange, reflects their level of emotional investment. When that quality drops, it's not usually because they've run out of things to say. It's because they've stopped prioritizing the emotional labor of staying engaged. They respond because not responding would be too obvious. But the responses themselves carry no weight. They don't build. They don't connect. They simply exist, maintaining the appearance of communication while offering little substance beneath it. For the person on the receiving end, this creates a unique kind of loneliness. They're still in contact with someone, still exchanging messages, still technically connected, but the connection feels hollow. There's no depth, no reciprocity, no sense that the other person is truly there. They begin to notice the absence of enthusiasm, the lack of curiosity, the way conversations end abruptly without resolution or continuation. What once felt like dialogue now feels like reporting. And the more they try to re-engage emotionally, the more they realize they're doing it alone. The other person has already stepped back, even if they haven't said so. What complicates this further is that neutral replies are hard to challenge. There's nothing technically wrong with them. They're polite. They're responsive. They don't break any explicit rules of communication, but they break something more fundamental, the unspoken agreement that both people will show up emotionally, not just logistically. And when that agreement dissolves without acknowledgement, the relationship begins to operate on two different levels. One person still invested in emotional exchange. The other, quietly withdrawing into something safer, colder, less demanding. Relationships, when functioning with mutual investment, tend to have a natural give and take. One person reaches out, the other responds. They take turns initiating, maintaining momentum, keeping the connection alive. But when one person begins to withdraw, that balance shifts. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the burden of maintaining connection falls more heavily on one side. The same person starts most conversations, sends the first message, makes the plans, asks the questions. And while the other person may still respond, they rarely initiate. They participate, but they don't drive. They're present, but only when prompted. This imbalance doesn't happen overnight, but once it's established, it becomes the new operating structure of the relationship. In attachment patterns, this kind of imbalance often reflects a deeper shift in emotional availability. The person who stops initiating isn't necessarily trying to send a message. They may not even be aware of the pattern. But their behavior reveals a reduced sense of urgency around the connection. They no longer feel the pull to reach out first. They don't feel compelled to keep things moving. They've become comfortable with silence, with distance, with letting the other person do the work. And because the other person is still invested, still trying, the relationship continues. But it continues in a way that feels increasingly one-sided, increasingly exhausting for the person carrying it. What makes this particularly painful is that it forces a kind of reckoning. The person doing the initiating begins to notice the pattern. They start wondering what would happen if they stopped reaching out. Would the other person notice? Would they care? Would they step in to fill the gap, or would the connection simply dissolve into silence? These questions create a low-level anxiety that lingers in the background of every interaction. The relationship starts to feel fragile, dependent entirely on their effort. And the more they notice this, the more resentful, exhausted, or invisible they begin to feel. The emotional labor becomes visible in a way it wasn't before. Behavioral patterns like these don't usually resolve on their own. When one person consistently initiates and the other consistently waits, it signals a fundamental misalignment in how both people value and prioritize the relationship. The person withdrawing may not realize the weight they've placed on the other, but the imbalance itself is unmistakable. And in that imbalance, something else starts to crystallize, a recognition that the connection is no longer being co-created. It's being maintained by one person's effort alone. When emotional distance begins to take shape, it doesn't usually arrive as one clear, decisive moment. It accumulates. A conversation cut short here. A plan canceled there. A moment of vulnerability met with silence instead of support. Each instance is small enough to be excused, explained, or forgotten. But when these micro-withdrawals repeat, they stop being isolated events and start forming a behavioral pattern. The person on the receiving end begins to notice a consistency in the inconsistency, a rhythm of pulling back that happens just often enough to feel intentional, even if it's never named. The pattern itself becomes the communication. And once the pattern is visible, it's hard to unsee. In relationship psychology, micro-withdrawals function as a form of emotional regulation. The person pulling back may not be doing so maliciously. They may be overwhelmed, uncertain, or struggling with their own attachment patterns. But the effect on the other person is cumulative. Each small withdrawal chips away at trust, at security, at the feeling of being valued. Over time, the other person stops expecting full presence. They begin to brace for distance. They adjust their own behavior to protect themselves from the repeated experience of being let down, even in small ways. The relationship dynamics shift from openness to caution, from spontaneity to guardedness. What makes this pattern particularly insidious is that it's difficult to address without sounding accusatory or paranoid. How do you tell someone they're pulling away when they haven't done anything overtly wrong? How do you point to a series of small behaviors and say, "This feels like rejection," without being told you're overreacting? The pattern lives in the space between actions, in the accumulation of absences, the repeated lack of follow-through, the way presence feels conditional rather than consistent. And because each individual instance seems minor, the person withdrawing can often deny the pattern entirely, leaving the other person feeling gaslit by their own perception. But patterns don't lie. They reveal what words often won't. And when someone repeatedly withdraws, emotionally, physically, conversationally, it signals something deeper than circumstance. It signals a shift in how they relate to the connection itself. They may not be ready to leave, but they're no longer fully in. And in that ambiguous space, something else begins to clarify. A need to read not just what's being said, but what's being withheld. When words stop being reliable indicators of someone's emotional state, behavior becomes the primary text. The person trying to understand what's happening starts reading into everything. The tone of a message, the timing of a reply, the length of a silence. They analyze how long it took for someone to respond. whether the message feels warm or detached, whether there's a question at the end or just a statement. These microanalyses aren't paranoia, they're pattern recognition. When someone's verbal communication no longer matches their emotional behavior, the mind begins searching for other sources of truth. And often, those sources are found not in what's said, but in how, when, and whether it's said at all. This shift in focus reflects a deeper psychological dynamic. In attachment patterns, when someone feels uncertain about where they stand, they become hypervigilant to cues that might clarify the situation. They start tracking behavioral consistency because they can no longer rely on explicit reassurance. The other person's words might say, "Everything's fine," but their behavior, delayed responses, lack of warmth, minimal effort, tells a different story. The person trying to make sense of this contradiction begins interpreting behavior like evidence in an investigation. They look for patterns. They compare past interactions to present ones. They try to decode meaning from tone and timing, because the emotional distance has made direct communication feel unsafe or unproductive. What makes this exhausting is that it turns the relationship into a constant interpretive task. Every interaction becomes something to analyze. Every silence becomes something to question. The emotional labor involved in constantly reading between the lines, in trying to decode what someone won't say directly, is immense. And it's isolating. Because while one person is working to interpret the other's behavior, the other person may be completely unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that their behavior is communicating anything at all. This creates a dynamic where one person is living in a state of heightened awareness, while the other remains emotionally opaque. Over time, this reliance on behavioral interpretation, rather than direct communication, erodes the foundation of the relationship. Trust becomes conditional. Security disappears. The person doing the interpreting begins to feel like they're constantly trying to solve a puzzle that the other person isn't even aware exists. And in that effort, something else starts to surface. A growing awareness that if understanding requires this much work, perhaps the connection itself has already shifted into something unrecognizable. When emotional withdrawal becomes noticeable, the mind immediately begins searching for explanations. Is this temporary? Are they going through something difficult right now? Is this situational stress? Or is this about me? These questions loop endlessly because the behavior itself offers no clear answers. The person pulling away rarely names what's happening, and the person experiencing the distance is left to fill in the blanks. The uncertainty is destabilizing. If the distance is temporary, it makes sense to wait, to be patient, to give space. But if it's personal, if it reflects a loss of interest, a shift in feeling, a quiet decision to disengage, then waiting becomes a form of denial. The challenge is that without direct communication, it's nearly impossible to know which interpretation is accurate. In relationship dynamics, this kind of internal questioning often reflects an attempt to preserve hope while managing fear. The person on the receiving end wants to believe the distance isn't about them. They want to trust that things will return to normal once external pressures ease. But as time passes and the distance doesn't lift, doubt begins to creep in. They start noticing that even when the supposed stressor is gone, the emotional withdrawal remains. The behavior doesn't improve. The warmth doesn't return. And slowly, the realization forms that maybe this isn't circumstantial at all. Maybe this is a choice, even if it's an unconscious one. Maybe the distance itself is the message. What complicates this further is that the person withdrawing may not have clarity themselves. They may genuinely believe they're just busy, just stressed, just needing space. But their behavior tells a different story. Emotional behavior doesn't lie the way words can. If someone has truly lost interest or emotional investment, their actions will reflect that, no matter what they say. And the person trying to understand the distance begins to recognize this gap between what's being claimed and what's being shown. They start to see that the distance isn't being actively addressed or repaired. It's being normalized. And in that normalization, something shifts internally. A quiet acceptance that the relationship may no longer be what it was. This internal questioning eventually reaches a threshold. The person can only spend so much time trying to decode whether the distance is temporary, situational, or personal before they realize the question itself is the answer. If someone wanted to close the distance, they would. If they valued the connection, they'd find a way to show up. And when that clarity arrives, it brings with it a different kind of question. Not about the other person's intentions, but about what happens when distance becomes the norm. At some point, the distance stops feeling like an anomaly and starts feeling like the new baseline. What once would have been concerning, a lack of warmth, minimal initiation, flat responses, becomes expected. The person on the receiving end adjusts. They stop asking for more because they've learned, through repeated experience, that more isn't available. They stop expecting the connection to feel the way it used to because that version of the relationship no longer exists. This normalization happens gradually, almost imperceptibly. One day, they realize they're no longer surprised by the distance. They've adapted to it. And in that adaptation, something fundamental has shifted. The relationship has reorganized itself around absence rather than presence. In psychological dynamics, this kind of normalization is both a coping mechanism and a form of resignation. The person experiencing the withdrawal learns to lower their expectations as a way of protecting themselves from repeated disappointment. They stop reaching out as often. They stop sharing as openly. They begin to mirror the emotional distance they've been receiving, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. The relationship continues, but it operates at a significantly reduced emotional capacity. Both people are still technically connected, but the depth, the intimacy, the sense of mutual investment, all of that has quietly eroded. And because the shift happened slowly, it's easy to miss the moment when closeness became optional rather than central. What makes this particularly painful is that the normalization often goes unacknowledged. Neither person names what's happened. The relationship just quietly rearranges itself into something smaller, something safer, something that requires less vulnerability and offers less reward. The person who once sought closeness learns to live without it. They stop initiating difficult conversations because they know those conversations won't lead anywhere. They stop expecting emotional reciprocity because they've learned that their partner is no longer operating from that place. The relationship becomes functional, polite, even stable in some ways. But it's no longer emotionally alive. And in that quiet acceptance, something else begins to crystallize. A recognition that reduced closeness isn't just a phase or a temporary adjustment. It's the new reality. And once that reality is normalized, it becomes much harder to confront. Because confronting it would mean admitting that the relationship has fundamentally changed, and that the person who once felt close now feels like a stranger living in familiar proximity. Reciprocity is the invisible architecture that holds relationships together. It's the unspoken agreement that both people will show up, invest, care, and contribute in ways that feel balanced over time. When reciprocity is present, the relationship feels natural. Effort flows in both directions. No one is keeping score because the exchange feels fair, organic, mutual. But when reciprocity breaks down, the entire structure begins to destabilize. One person gives more, the other takes more. One person initiates, the other waits. One person feels responsible for maintaining the connection. The other assumes it will be maintained for them. And over time, this imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. The awareness of lost reciprocity doesn't usually arrive as a sudden realization. It builds quietly, through repeated experiences of giving without receiving, of reaching out without being met, of offering emotional labor that goes unmatched. The person carrying the weight of the relationship begins to notice the asymmetry. They start paying attention to who texts first, who makes plans, who remembers important details, who asks meaningful questions. And what they find is a pattern of one-sided effort. The other person may still respond, still participate when prompted, still claim to care. But they're no longer contributing equally. They've become passive recipients of the relationship rather than active co-creators of it. In relationship psychology, this loss of reciprocity is one of the most reliable indicators of emotional disengagement. When someone stops matching effort, it's not because they're incapable. It's because they've stopped prioritizing the relationship in the way they once did. Their emotional investment has declined, and their behavior reflects that decline. They may not be consciously choosing to withdraw, but their lack of reciprocity speaks louder than any words. And for the person noticing this, it creates a painful dilemma. Do they keep giving, hoping the other person will eventually step up? Or do they pull back and risk the relationship dissolving entirely? What often happens is a quiet withdrawal of their own. Not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. They stop initiating as much. They stop offering as freely. They begin to conserve their emotional energy because they've realized it's not being reciprocated. And in that conservation, the relationship begins to fade. Not dramatically, not with conflict or confrontation. Just a slow, mutual drift into distance. One person because they stopped trying, the other because they finally stopped compensating for it. Emotional withdrawal doesn't need your permission to reshape a relationship. It doesn't wait for acknowledgement. It doesn't pause for confrontation. It simply continues, quietly restructuring the connection until what remains is no longer recognizable as what it once was. The small behaviors, the delays, the flatness, the imbalance, the silence, aren't isolated incidents. They're coordinates on a map you didn't know you were reading. And once you see the map clearly, you understand that the distance wasn't accidental. It was patterned. It was consistent. It was, in its own way, a choice being made incrementally, behavior by behavior, until the relationship existed only in maintenance mode, held together by one person's effort and the other's passive participation. What you do with that awareness is not something that can be prescribed. There's no technique here, no strategy to reverse what's already in motion. But there is clarity. And clarity, even when it's uncomfortable, is always more useful than confusion. The behavior has already told you what words won't. The pattern has already shown you where things stand. What remains is whether you're willing to see it fully, without softening it, without waiting for it to explain itself. because it won't. Withdrawal doesn't justify itself. It just is. If you've recognized these patterns in your own experience, you're not imagining it. You're noticing what was always there, and that noticing matters. Not because it fixes anything, but because it returns you to reality. The one where behavior is evidence, where distance is communication, and where the relationship you thought you were in may not be the one you're actually living. But here's what most people don't realize. Emotional withdrawal doesn't just happen in phases. It has a point of no return. A threshold where distance stops being temporary and starts becoming permanent. And if you're still trying to make sense of what you're seeing, you need to understand what happens when detachment crosses that line. I covered that extensively in the previous video. When emotional detachment quietly becomes permanent, that's where the pattern completes itself. That's where the behavior stops being reversible. If you haven't watched it yet, you need to. Not because it offers solutions, but because it shows you the full arc of what you're already witnessing. Don't wait until you're past the point of recognition to understand what was happening all along. If this resonates, subscribe and turn on notifications. This is the kind of analysis you won't find elsewhere, and it only gets sharper from here.